Today on JiK Labs, we're going to re-examine the if function, how to utilize it on multiple levels, as well as adding in some other equations into the logic test. Let's get started. Now that we have Excel open and ready to go, we are back on our data tab, which contains the sales data, the hypothetical sales data that we've made. And in our previous if video, we went and made an if function for commissions owed. We said if the invoice was paid, meaning invoice equals Y, take GP dollars times 50% or 0.5 and report that here. If the invoice was not paid, we reported $0. And that's great. That's a simple if function, one variable, good to go. So with our first example, that is an easy if equation. One logic test, do this or that. Well, what happens if you want to say, well, what if the invoice has been paid and GP dollars are negative? Or in this case, we're going to look at if the invoice has been paid, invoice paid equals Y, and GP dollars are greater than 0. If it's a negative GP dollars, we're going to say no commissions paid for this example, just because we already have this data set up. Generally, a negative commission would go against the salesperson as well. But in this example, we're going to set it to 0. So there's a couple ways you can go about doing this. Right now, we're going to look at an if function. Once again, we come into here, if, and we do our first logic test. If H3 equals Y, and then we're going to hit the comma, and then we're going to nest another if equation into our math. So our logic test, if H3 equals Y, then we're going to say if GP dollars are greater than or equal to 0, what do we do when both of those are true? Because this is the first confines of our first logic test. If invoice paid equals Y, then we're saying if GP dollars is greater than or equal to 0, if both of those are true, we're going to come in here and say GP dollars times 0.5. If false, we're going to say 0. And again, since we have close the parentheses, since we have two equations in there, we still have to tell the value of false for the very first equation. So we will also set that at 0. And then we're going to go ahead and hit enter. You will notice that these values are exactly the same. That is because the invoice has been paid and GP dollars are greater than 0. So let's come in here and particularly look at these two equations. Let's copy our equation down, and we'll see that all these other rows are equaling. But when we get into this negative number, because negative 26% and negative 80% are not greater than or equal to 0, it is a false statement. Therefore, we are reporting $0. So to come up here as a quick, this is what this equation looks like. If invoice paid equals Y, then check to see if GP percentage is greater than or equal to 0. If that is true, then GP dollars times 50%. Otherwise, if it's false, 0. And if it is the invoice is not been paid, report 0. So first again, if we look at H1, invoice paid, if that equals Y, we skip over this true right here. We skipped over this true part, and we go directly to reporting the false on the first if equation. Now that is how you can nest multiple if equations into the same equation. You could keep going if you had more and more variables to check. That could get very complicated. You would have a lot of confusion in there trying to figure out what goes where. So now we're going to look at how to make it a little bit easier utilizing the functions we looked at last week, and, or, and not. We're going to focus on and today, but the same would be true on all the equations for nesting them inside an if function. So we're going to use and we're going to try to duplicate the results here with the nested if functions by utilizing AND. So once again, we'll start with if, open those parentheses, and we're going to immediately say AND because we want to perform two logic tests. So we're going to come in here and say that H3 equals Y, comma, to add a logic test, and we're going to say GP percentage is greater than or equal to 0. And we'll close those parentheses. By doing that, we say if, and then we're going to do our logic test, which is an AND function. So we want to say if H3, or invoice paid, equals Y, and GP percentage is greater than or equal to 0, if it reports true, what do we want it to do? We want to take GP dollars times 0.5, and if it's false, we're going to report $0. We will go ahead and close that parentheses and hit enter. And you'll see, here we go, all three of these numbers are exactly the same. Let's come up here so you can see this function as it's written down below, and we're going to copy this down. You're going to see that these two columns, our results are identical. So as I mentioned, with a nested if function, you can check more than one logic test. In our instance, invoice paid equals Y and GP percentage is greater than or equal to 0. If both of those are true, then it's going to perform the function that we set forth. If both are false, or either one of those are false, it will report $0. You can do that with many if functions within an if function and build it and make it as complicated as you wish. But since we are looking at a statement saying that we want both of these to be true, we can cut out the nested if functions and utilize if with the AND function. And again, that's if, and then our logic test is AND, invoice paid equals Y, and GP percentage is greater than or equal to 0. And remember from last week, AND will only report true if both of those logic tests are in fact true. So if one of them is wrong, or one of them is false rather, it will report false. So on that equation, we will see if both are true, it's going to say GP dollars times 0.5. If either one of these are false, it reports 0. There is no wrong answer when trying to get these results, but utilizing if with AND does make your equation a little bit cleaner, considering if you had more logic tests, for example 3 or 4, you would get a lot more complicated if you nested the if functions inside the if functions. Now there is a time when you may want to do that, is if you're going through your logic tests and you want the if-then statements to be a little bit different, then you can change the results within the confines. So let's just go, for example, let's actually change this equation just to show you what I'm talking about. So right now we have this set up. We all know how it's set up, but we're going to come in here and say GP negative. Of course, the first one did not change because it's copied. So we're going to come down here and copy the rest of them. And now we can see in these two guys that we're reporting GP negative. GP negative. Why is that? Well, again, with an if that is nested within an if function, you can have multiple then results. So right here, H3 equals Y, correct. So we go to the next test. Is GP dollars greater than or equal to 0? And the answer is no. So right here in that nested if function, we're saying spit out GP negative, which it did in this case. If we immediately start with H3Y and it's no, it reports a 0. The nested if functions allow you to do a lot more complicated logic tests and if-then statements, or if you're just looking for all of your logic tests, or you have multiple criteria and you want to report the same answers regardless what, you just want it to all meet the same criteria, you can use the AND function in the confines of an if function. Hopefully that's a little bit more in-depth look for you of the abilities to nest equations into other equations in Microsoft Excel, specifically the if function with additional logic tests. And we'll see you all next week. Today on JiK Labs, we're going to